The man didn't even look at her when he said it. Harold Briggs, the largest egg supplier in Caldwell County, stood at the edge of the auction pen with his thumbs hooked in his belt loops and his voice loud enough to carry across 3 rows of farmers. He looked at the crates. He looked at the broken, half-feathered hens stumbling against each other. Then he looked at Norah Whitlock, 24 years old, army grease still fading from her knuckles, and he laughed. "Sweetheart," he said, and the word was a weapon. "You just paid $15 to dig 300 graves." The crowd erupted. Not nervous laughter, real laughter, the kind that sticks to a person for years. Norah didn't move. She didn't argue. She just looked at those birds. And something in her jaw went tight. If you've ever been laughed out of a room for believing in something nobody else could see, this story is for you. Stay until the end, because what happened next took 4 years, cost everything, and eventually silenced every single person in that crowd. Before we go further, if stories like this one move you, please subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. Drop your city and country in the comments right now. I genuinely want to see how far this story travels. Every comment tells me someone, somewhere, needed to hear this today. Now let's go back to that auction yard, because what Norah did next, nobody saw coming. The morning it all started, Norah Whitlock had exactly $15.63 to her name, a duffel bag with a broken zipper, and a 1994 pickup truck that burned oil on left turns. She hadn't planned to stop at the Caldwell County livestock auction. She had driven past that gravel lot 100 times as a kid, pressed against the truck window while her grandfather navigated the ruts, watching men in feed caps shake hands over cattle she'd never understand. But that morning, something made her slow down. Maybe it was the hand-painted cardboard sign near the entrance that read, "Laying Hens. Clearance." Maybe it was just that she had nowhere better to be. She pulled in. The auction barn smelled the way she remembered, a thick mix of sawdust, animal heat, and old coffee from a machine that had probably been there since the 1980s. Men stood in clusters, a few women near the fence. Everybody knew everybody, and Norah knew almost none of them. 6 years away does that to a person. 6 years in military motor pools in places that didn't make the news, repairing engines under conditions that would have broken most people twice her age. 6 years of that will make your hometown feel like a museum exhibit of a life you used to have. She found a spot near the back rail and watched. The first 3 lots moved fast. Feeder pigs, a small herd of goats, a trailer full of sheep that sold before the auctioneer even finished the opening sentence. The crowd knew what it wanted. These were working farmers, and working farmers don't waste breath on sentiment. Then the side gate opened and the hens came out. They came in wire crates stacked 4 high on a flatbed cart, and the sound they made wasn't the sound of healthy birds. It was quieter than that, a kind of low, ragged murmuring, like something that had been noisy once and forgotten how. Norah could see, even from the back, that these weren't prime stock. Their feathers were dull and patchy. A few sat with their heads tucked sideways in a way that suggested they'd stopped expecting much. The commercial tag on the crate read, "Layer flock, end of cycle, sold as lot." End of cycle. That was the polite term. It meant these birds had been pushed until they stopped producing reliably, and now they were considered garbage. Most of them would be processed. The ones who survived the auction would probably go to a small operation that would burn through whatever was left in them and do the same thing again. Norah stared at the crates. She had grown up with chickens. Not commercially. Her grandfather, Dale Whitlock, had kept a flock on the back half of the family property in Blackbriar Hollow, in the way that people who remember the Depression keep things. Carefully. Quietly. With notebooks full of observations that nobody else thought mattered. He had names for half of them. He had records going back decades, feed weights, molt cycles, egg color patterns that shifted with the seasons. He talked about those birds the way other men talked about horses, with a specific kind of respect that acknowledged they had their own interior logic, their own particular genius that most people never bothered to understand. Dale Whitlock had been dead for 2 years, and his farm had been sitting empty for most of that time, waiting for Norah to decide what to do with it. She still hadn't decided. The auctioneer started the bidding low, lower than low. The crowd was polite but distant. Nobody here was in the business of rescuing spent hens. One man near the front made a half-hearted bid, then shook his head and stepped back. Another laughed outright when the auctioneer tried to climb the number. That was when Harold Briggs started talking. Norah didn't know his name yet. She would learn it soon enough. He was standing maybe 15 feet from her, broad across the shoulders, with the confident posture of someone who had been the biggest voice in most rooms he'd ever entered. His operation, Briggs Family Farms, though the family part was debatable given how he treated employees, supplied eggs to roughly a third of the commercial accounts in the county. He had trucks. He had contracts. He had the kind of clout that made local officials take his calls on the first ring. He also, Norah would come to understand, had a deep and abiding conviction that the world worked exactly one way, and anyone who tried to operate differently was either stupid or delusional. 300 worn-out birds, he said to the man beside him, not quietly. Whoever buys these things is paying to haul dead weight. He paused. Literally. A few people nearby chuckled. Norah looked at the crates again. She looked at one hen in particular, a bird near the front corner of the lowest crate, pressed against the wire, head slightly up, watching. Not panicked, just watching, the way something does when it's been through enough that panic seems like a luxury it can no longer afford. She raised her hand. $15. She didn't think carefully about it. That was the honest truth. There was no grand strategy in that moment, no business plan assembling itself in the back of her mind. It was something more primitive than planning. It was recognition. She looked at those birds, and she saw something that shouldn't be thrown away. And she bid before the rational part of her brain could explain why that was probably a terrible idea. The auctioneer looked at her. A beat of silence crossed the barn. Then Harold Briggs turned around. He looked her over in the way that some men do. Not aggressive, exactly, but appraising, filing her away in a category. Young, female. Nobody he recognized, nobody who mattered, his expression suggested, to the actual business of this place. "Sweetheart," he said, and the word landed like a flat hand on a table. "You just paid $15 to dig 300 graves." The laughter spread fast. Not everyone, not quite, but enough. A ripple through the crowd that Norah felt in her sternum more than she heard with her ears. She had heard laughter directed at her before. Boot camp had a specific variety of it. The first time she'd walked into a motor pool as the only woman, she'd learned to catalog it. The nervous kind, the testing kind, the dismissive kind. This was the dismissive kind, which was in some ways the hardest, because it didn't come from malice. It came from absolute certainty. They weren't trying to hurt her. They just genuinely thought she didn't know what she was doing. She paid at the table. The woman behind the register didn't quite meet her eyes. Norah folded the receipt and put it in her jacket pocket and walked back out to the flatbed, and she stood there looking at 300 crates of birds that had been given up on, and she thought about her grandfather. He had a phrase he used whenever something looked worse than it was. He'd say, "Things show you who they are when they've been pushed past what they thought they could take." He'd said it about animals, about weather, about people. He'd said it about her once when she was 16 and had failed her driver's test twice and was ready to quit. He hadn't made a speech about it. He just said it, quietly, over coffee, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. She drove the hens home in 2 trips. The farm was in worse shape than she'd let herself believe until she actually arrived with something living that needed tending to. The main crop had a section of wire that had rusted through, a water line that had frozen and cracked the previous winter, and a corner of the roof that had been repaired once badly and was now waiting to fail entirely. The pasture fencing was intact, but the gates were warped. The feeding area was overgrown. The whole property had the particular quality of something that had been loved and then left, which is different from something that was never loved at all, but only in ways that make the sadness more specific. Norah spent her first afternoon not unpacking her own things, but fixing the coop. She used tools from the barn, a roll of wire she found in the shed, and a temporary patch on the water line that she knew would only last a week if she was lucky. She worked until she couldn't see well enough to work safely. Then she went inside, ate crackers and peanut butter because there was nothing else, and fell asleep on the couch because making the bed felt like one step too many. She woke up at 5 the next morning to check on the birds. 12 had not made it through the night. She found them still and flat-feathered in the corners of the coop, arranged the way things arrange themselves when they've simply stopped. She removed them quietly, one by one, carried them out behind the barn, and stood there in the early dark for a minute that felt longer. Then she went back inside and made coffee with the last of the grounds her grandfather had left in the cabinet, old enough that it was probably expired but still better than nothing. And she opened one of his notebooks. Dale Whitlock's notebooks were not professional documents. They were composition books, the black and white kind you could buy for $1 at any pharmacy, filled with his loose, slightly tilted handwriting and occasional small sketches of things he was trying to describe and couldn't quite put into words. He had filled 11 of them over 40 years. Norah had read parts of them before, as a teenager, but she'd read them the way teenagers read things, skimming the surface, picking up fragments, not understanding that she was looking at a system. She sat at the kitchen table and read more carefully. The third notebook, from what she could reconstruct, covered a period roughly 30 years back when Dale had taken on a small flock in poor condition from a neighbor who was moving. His notes from those first weeks were careful and unsparing. He'd recorded losses without emotion, just dates and numbers. But he'd also recorded what he'd tried, what had worked, what hadn't, and why he thought that was. Rotational grazing, specific feed ratios, slow reintroduction to sunlight and open space, minimal handling in the early days. Patience described not as a virtue, but as a practical tool. They need to remember what they are before they can do what they're supposed to do. She read that line 3 times. She was still at the table when the sun came up enough to make the kitchen bright, and she heard the first real sounds from the coop. Not the weak murmuring of the previous night, but something with a little more intention behind it. She went out and stood in the door of the coop and watched the birds move, and she started taking notes in a fresh composition book she'd found in a kitchen drawer, blank except for a few multiplication tables her grandfather had written in the front for reasons she couldn't begin to guess. She wrote down what she saw. Not what she hoped, what she actually saw. It was not encouraging, taken as a snapshot, but she was learning, slowly, not to look at things as snapshots. The feed situation was the first real crisis. She had enough for 5 days, maybe 6 if she stretched it, and she had no money. She had no credit either. She'd come home with debt from the end of her service term, a situation she didn't like to think about too directly, because thinking about it too directly made her hands shake a little. The farm's accounts had been empty for almost a year. Her grandfather's modest savings had gone to the funeral, and the property taxes, paid just barely in time. She drove into town on the 4th day to ask about credit at the feed store. The feed store in Blackbriar Hollow had been run by the Alderman family for as long as anyone could remember, currently by a man named Gene Alderman, who had known Dale Whitlock for decades and had been at the funeral and had shaken Nora's hand and said all the right things. She had thought of him as an ally. She walked in expecting at least a conversation. Gene was behind the counter when she came in. He recognized her immediately, and his face did something complicated. Genuinely warm in one direction, genuinely uncomfortable in another. "Norah, good to see you up and around." "You too, Gene." She explained the situation plainly. She needed feed on credit, a few weeks at most, just until she could get things moving. Gene Alderman listened with the careful expression of a man who was about to say no and was hoping to find a way to say it that would let them both feel better afterward. "Thing is," he started, and she knew before the second word what the rest of the sentence was going to be. "You heard about the auction," she said. He hesitated. "Word gets around." "And?" "Norah." He spread his hands on the counter in a gesture that was meant to convey helplessness. 300 spent hens. Harold came in yesterday, and he was pretty clear about what he thought the odds were. She felt something harden in the center of her chest. Not anger, something more compressed than anger. "Harold Briggs was in here talking about my farm. He's a big account." "I know what he is." There was a pause that stretched uncomfortably. "I can do 2 weeks," Gene said finally. "That's what I can do." "But Norah, I've known you since you were this high, and I knew your granddad 30 years, and I'm telling you honestly, as a friend, if this doesn't turn around fast, you're going to be in a hole you can't climb out of." She took the feed on 2 weeks' credit. She thanked him and meant it, even knowing what had been behind his hesitation. She wasn't naive enough to expect people to bet on her for free. In the truck on the way home, she rolled the window down and let the cold October air in and thought about Harold Briggs standing at the feed store counter, talking to Gene Alderman about her odds. She thought about the hen pressed against the wire in the auction crate. Head up, still watching. She pressed the gas a little harder on the empty county road. Back at the farm, she set up the rotational access her grandfather's notebooks described, sectioning off portions of the pasture so the birds couldn't exhaust any one patch of ground, cycling them through in a rhythm that gave each section time to recover. It was more work than simply letting them range freely, but the notebooks were very specific about this, and she had decided to treat the notebooks like technical manuals rather than suggestions. She had spent 6 years following technical manuals in situations where improvising meant engines failed, and sometimes people got hurt. She knew the value of precision. She also began what she privately called the quiet protocol, spending time in the coop without doing anything, just being present, moving slowly, speaking occasionally in a low voice. She felt slightly ridiculous doing it the first few times, but the notebooks mentioned it, and she could see over the first week that the birds were registering her presence differently. Less alarm, less of that tight, compressed movement that frightened animals use to make themselves small. She was running on 5 or 6 hours of sleep a night, sometimes 4. The waterline patch had failed, as she'd predicted, and she'd rigged a temporary solution with a hose and a heat lamp that she was reasonably sure was a fire risk and had to check twice a night. The roof corner worried her every time it rained. She had a list on the kitchen counter of things that needed fixing, numbered by urgency, and the list had 22 items on it, and the top 12 all felt equally urgent. At the end of the second week, with 1 day left on Jean Alderman's credit window, she found the first real egg. It was in a nest box she'd rebuilt and refilled with clean straw, and it sat there in the low morning light like something the situation hadn't earned yet. She picked it up carefully. The shell was thin, fragile in a way that good shells shouldn't be, but the color was deep, a warm brown that suggested something the commercial pale ones never did. She stood there in the coop holding it for a moment that was probably too long for a person holding a single egg. Then she put it down, went back to the house, and called her Great Aunt Esther Hale. Esther was 81 years old and lived 12 miles away in a house so full of plants that walking through it felt like moving through a very organized forest. She was her grandfather's older sister and the only member of the family who had known Dale Whitlock longer than Norah had, which meant she was also the only person Norah could call who wouldn't offer advice attached to a warning about how this was probably going to fail. "First egg," Norah said when Esther picked up. A pause. "Shell quality?" "Thin, but the color's right." "The color means the bird is starting to pull nutrition from real sources instead of running on reserves," Esther said, as matter-of-factly as if she were discussing weather patterns. "The shell will thicken. Give it time." "How much time?" "As much as it takes." Esther's voice was dry, but not unkind. "Your grandfather used to say that the worst thing you can do is rush something that's healing. You can set it back by weeks if you push. Jean Alderman's credit runs out tomorrow." "I know." "You know?" "Norah, I live 12 miles away, not on the moon. People talk." A brief pause. "There's $200 in a coffee can in my pantry above the flour. I've been saving it for something that needed it. Come get it." Norah didn't want to take it. She almost said so. Esther spoke before she could. "Don't you dare turn it down and then tell me about your pride," the old woman said, sharply enough that Norah almost laughed. "Your grandfather would have taken it and said thank you, and you're going to do the same thing." She drove to Esther's house that evening. She stayed for 2 hours. They drank coffee and talked about the notebooks, and Esther clarified things that had been unclear: feeding practices, molt cycle management, something about water mineral content that her grandfather had written in shorthand she hadn't fully decoded. Esther spoke about these things from memory, from a lifetime of watching, and Norah sat across from her with a fresh composition book and wrote down everything. Driving home with $200 and 3 pages of new notes, the road dark and the truck's heater making its usual clicking sound, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not confidence, exactly. Something narrower and more specific than confidence. She felt like she was doing the right thing. That didn't mean it was going to work. She understood that clearly. But there was a difference between doing something and hoping, and doing something you actually believed in, and for the first time since she'd raised her hand at that auction, she was standing on the right side of that line. Behind her, in the dark of the farm she was driving back toward, 300 hens, 276 now, and counting, were learning in their own slow time what real ground felt like under their feet. And in a feed store 12 miles away, a man named Harold Briggs was already telling someone else that she'd be gone by spring. He was wrong, but he didn't know that yet. The first egg had been a whisper. What came after was the farm learning to speak again, one word at a time, and none of it was easy. November arrived in Blackbriar Hollow the way it always did, without apology. The cold came down off the ridge in waves, and the mornings turned the kind of gray that made you understand why people in old photographs always looked so serious. Norah was up before light every day, not because she'd set an alarm, but because her body had calibrated itself to the farm's rhythms the way it had once calibrated to military schedules. Something would tighten in her sleep around 4:30, and she'd be awake before her eyes opened, already running through the list. Water line, coop temperature, feed rotation, pasture sections. The roof corner she still hadn't fully fixed because the right materials cost money she didn't have yet. The egg count was climbing, but not fast. By the end of the third week, she was getting maybe 30 eggs a day from 268 birds, which was a number so low it would have made a commercial operation weep. But she'd read enough of her grandfather's notebooks by then to understand that this was not failure. This was the birds burning through whatever the previous operation had depleted from them, rebuilding from the inside out, and the egg count was simply a byproduct of that process rather than the point of it. The point of it, for now, was survival. Hers and theirs. She was cracking 3 of the eggs one morning to check yolk color, a habit she'd picked up from the notebooks, where her grandfather tracked color like other men tracked weather. When she heard tires on the gravel, she wasn't expecting anyone. The truck that pulled in was a newer model than anything she drove, and the man who climbed out of it was young, maybe 19 or 20, with the build of someone who'd been doing physical work since he was old enough to lift things. He had a knit cap pulled low and a jacket that had seen better seasons, and he stood by his truck with his hands in his pockets looking at the coop like he was trying to decide something. Norah came out of the barn and watched him for a second. "Help you?" she called. He turned. "You're the one who bought those hens at the Caldwell auction." It wasn't a question. "I am," she said. "I was there," he said. "I helped load the crates onto your truck. You probably don't remember me." She didn't, and she didn't pretend to. "What do you want?" He shifted his weight. "I'm looking for work. I've done farm labor the last 3 years, mostly cattle, over at the Hendricks place, but they're cutting back for winter, and I got 2 days a week instead of 5, and I can't make that work." He paused. "I heard you might need help." "Who told you that?" "Honest answer? Gene Alderman mentioned it. Not in a bad way," he added quickly. "Just said you were running a place alone and it was a lot." Norah looked at him. He met her eyes without either aggression or the particular brand of excessive eagerness that made her suspicious. He just looked like someone who needed work and was willing to say so plainly. "I can't pay much," she said. "Barely anything, to be straight with you." "I know. You know, and you're still here." "I'm good with birds," he said, which was either honest or a very well-timed thing to say. "My grandmother kept laying hens when I was a kid. I know how to handle them without stressing them out." She looked at him another moment. "What's your name?" "Evan Brooks." She told him to come back the next morning at 5:30, and she'd see how he worked, and she turned around and went back to the barn, because she had 14 things to do before noon, and standing in the driveway deciding whether to trust a stranger was already using up time she didn't have. He was there at 5:15. That was the first thing she noted about Evan Brooks. He was early, not in a show-off way. He didn't bang on the door or announce himself. She just came out of the house at 5:20, and he was already at the coop checking the water, quiet and methodical, and the birds near him were not alarmed. That was the second thing she noted. Animals register something about people that humans usually miss, and these birds had been through enough that their alarm system was well calibrated. They weren't alarmed by Evan. She didn't say anything about either observation. She just handed him a feed pail, and they started the morning routine, and that was that. He became a fixed part of the farm within 2 weeks, working 3 days for whatever she could scrape together, which was not enough, and both of them knew it, but Evan Brooks was one of those people who operated on a longer time horizon than his age suggested. He didn't talk a lot, which suited her. When he did talk, it was either about something practical or something he'd actually thought about, and she found over the first weeks that she valued that more than she'd expected to after years of being around people who filled silence with noise because silence made them uncomfortable. The egg count reached 60 per day in the third week of November, 73 by the end of the month. Still far from what the flock was theoretically capable of, but moving in a direction that felt less like dying and more like recovering. What Norah hadn't anticipated was the quality conversation. She hadn't been marketing anything. She hadn't put up signs or made calls or done any of the things a person starting a business is supposed to do. Partly because she didn't have the energy, and partly because she wasn't thinking in those terms yet. She was thinking in terms of keeping things alive long enough to see what they became. But a woman named Patrice Dumont, who ran a small breakfast restaurant in the county seat called the Hollow Table, drove out one Thursday because she'd heard something secondhand from someone who'd mentioned something offhand, which is how information travels in small places. Patrice was in her mid-50s and had the focused energy of someone who had run a kitchen long enough to have strong opinions about everything and the patience to listen to exactly none of your excuses. She knocked on the door at 9 in the morning while Norah was in the middle of fixing the water line, actually fixing it this time, not patching it. And Norah came around the corner of the house with mud on her knees and a wrench in her hand. Patrice looked at the wrench. "I've interrupted something." "You have. What do you need?" "I need eggs," Patrice said. "Not your eggs specifically. I need eggs that taste like something. I've been buying from the Briggs operation for 3 years, and lately, I don't know what he's changed, but the yolks are pale and the whites are thin, and my customers are starting to comment." Norah lowered the wrench slightly. "Who sent you out here?" "Nobody sent me. I asked around. Someone said you had a flock that was producing something different." She paused. "Can I see one?" Norah brought her into the barn and cracked an egg into a bowl in the light from the open door. The yolk sat up high and orange, the kind of orange that looks almost wrong if you've spent your whole life looking at pale commercial yolks. The white was dense enough to hold its shape. Patrice stared at it for a moment. "How many can you give me a week?" she said. "Right now? Maybe 4 dozen?" Patrice's face did something complicated. "That's not enough for what I need." "I know. But it's a start." "It is," Norah said carefully, "if you understand that what you're getting right now is the beginning of something that's going to get better, not the finished product." Patrice looked at her. "You're not going to oversell it." "I can't afford to oversell it. If you start buying and you tell people and then the quality drops because I push too hard, I've lost you and everyone you told. I'd rather you know exactly what this is." There was a pause, and Patrice nodded slowly. "Your grandfather was Dale Whitlock." Norah kept her expression neutral. "He was. He used to sell to the Hollow Table before I owned it. The previous owner talked about those eggs like they were a different category of thing." She looked at the egg in the bowl again. "I always thought he was exaggerating." She took 4 dozen eggs and left Norah with a check that was modest but real, and a verbal agreement to come back the following week, which felt more significant than the money because it meant somebody was planning around her being there. That evening, after Evan had gone and the birds were settled, Norah sat at the kitchen table and opened the 9th notebook. She'd been working through them in order, slowly, saving the later ones for when she understood enough to read them correctly. The 9th notebook covered a period she hadn't known about. Her grandfather's early 40s, a time before she was born, when he'd apparently gone through something with the flock that had made him rebuild it almost from scratch. The entry that stopped her was dated late October from roughly 3 decades back. "Lost most of the original line this fall. Disease came through fast and we didn't catch it in time. What's left is 16 birds. I should start over with new stock, but something about these 16 bothers me enough to try. They came through when most didn't. That means something, even if I can't quantify it yet. Esther thinks I'm being sentimental. Maybe. But the ones that survive what they shouldn't are the ones worth building from." She read that entry twice. Then she went to the window and looked out at the coop and thought about what it would mean if the birds she had, the ones who had survived the auction, the first hard weeks, the cold, the thin feed, were descended from whatever Dale Whitlock had decided to build from 30 years ago. She didn't know yet, but she tucked the thought somewhere careful. December arrived and the roof corner finally gave in. Not dramatically. Just a section of shingles that lifted in a night wind and let water in, which she discovered at 2 in the morning when a dripping sound woke her and she found a spreading wet patch on the kitchen ceiling. She put a bucket under it and lay in bed staring at the dark and did the math she'd been avoiding. Roof repair, remaining feed debt, upcoming property tax installment, truck maintenance that she'd been postponing for 3 months. The numbers didn't add up. They weren't close to adding up. She got up at 4, made coffee, and sat at the table with her budget written on a piece of notebook paper, and she went through it the way she'd been trained to approach a problem. Not emotionally, but systematically, looking for where the variables could shift. The Patrice account was real, but small. She needed 2 more like it minimum to keep the roof from becoming a crisis that became a catastrophe. She needed the egg count to climb, which it was doing but slowly, which meant she needed time, which meant she needed money to buy that time, which was the specific loop she'd been running inside since the first day. She called Esther at 6, which was not an unreasonable hour to call Esther Hale, because Esther had been waking at 5:30 for so long that she considered 6 a civilized mid-morning. "The roof," Norah said. "How bad?" "Manageable if I do it this week. Worse if I wait." "Then do it this week." A pause. "What's the real question?" Norah exhaled. "The real question is whether the egg count gets where it needs to be before I run out of room to absorb problems." Esther was quiet for a moment. "Tell me the count," Norah told her. Eggs per day, quality trend, Patrice Dumont's account, the 2 other small leads she'd been meaning to follow up on, but hadn't had time. "The count is right," Esther said. "That's a healthy recovery curve. Your grandfather's notes say 6 weeks to 8 weeks before the production uptick starts to hold. You're at week 7. I know what the notes say." "Then you know you're not failing." "I know I might run out of money before the uptick holds." Another pause, longer. "Come for dinner Sunday. Bring your books." She drove out Sunday with her composition notebooks and the budget paper and a jar of the eggs, because she always brought Esther eggs now. Esther cooked them simply. Nothing elaborate, just scrambled with butter. And she ate them with the focused attention of someone conducting a professional evaluation. "Better than last time," she said. "I know." "The mineral content is changing. What did you do differently?" Norah told her about a feed adjustment she'd made based on an entry in the 7th notebook, adding crushed shell and a specific dried plant mix her grandfather had noted improved shell density. She'd found the dried plant at a small farm supply operation 2 counties over, the kind of place that still stocked things that commercial suppliers had stopped carrying because the demand was too small to bother with. Esther nodded. "He learned that from our mother," she said, which was the first time she'd mentioned their family that way. In a chain going backward, each person learning something from the person before them, handing it forward. She kept a flock during the lean years, and those birds outproduced everything in the county because she paid attention to things that other people thought were superstition. What did they think was superstition? The soil. What the soil gave the plants. What the plants gave the birds. What the birds gave the eggs. Esther set down her fork. "The commercial people think you can shortcut that chain. You can, for a while. The eggs still come, but they become something less than what they could be, and eventually even the commercial people notice, which is why that woman from the hollow table came to see you." Norah thought about Patrice Dumont standing in her barn, looking at an egg yolk, like she was seeing something she'd forgotten existed. They spent the rest of the evening with the books. Esther pointed to things Norah had misread or underread, places in the notebooks where Dale's shorthand compressed a practice that needed more unpacking. She also told her, for the first time, something about the original flock, that there had been a particular bloodline Dale had been working to stabilize for years, something he'd started with birds from Esther's own flock when they were both much younger, selecting for health and resilience rather than pure production numbers. "What happened to it?" Norah asked. "He never talked about it much in the later years. I assumed he'd given it up." Esther's voice was careful. "But those notebooks go further back than you've read yet." Norah looked at her. "You think it's possible?" "I think," Esther said deliberately, "that your grandfather spent 40 years paying attention to things most people couldn't be bothered to notice. And I think you should read all the notebooks before you decide what's possible and what isn't." She drove home in the dark with that sitting in her chest like something trying to hatch. The egg count crossed 100 per day the 2nd week of December. Then it held there, not climbing for 4 days, and Norah went through a stretch of genuine doubt that she didn't mention to anyone, not even Evan, because the doubt wasn't useful, and speaking it aloud would only make it heavier. She went back to the notebooks instead. She adjusted the rotation. She made a small change to the sheltering arrangement based on something she'd read about wind exposure, which sounded almost too minor to matter, and 3 days later the count moved again. 112. Then 118. Then she made the call to the county's only upscale restaurant, a place called Tallow House that had opened 2 years ago and was trying to do farm-to-table in a county that hadn't entirely decided whether farm-to-table was a real thing or a city affectation. The owner was a man named Marcus Webb, who had trained in kitchens in other states before coming back to open his own place, and he had a reputation for being difficult to impress and easy to annoy. She almost didn't call. She didn't have enough volume for a restaurant account. She had no professional packaging, no refrigerated transport, nothing that looked like a real supply operation. She had eggs in cardboard cartons that Evan had sourced from a closing farm supply and a handwritten label that she'd done herself. She called anyway. Marcus Webb picked up on the second ring, and she introduced herself and said she had laying hens on pasture in Blackbriar Hollow, and she wanted to bring him eggs to try. There was a pause on the line. How many birds? 260. Per week? What are you running? She told him the current count. Another pause, longer. That's not enough, he said flatly. I know. So why are you calling me? Because in 8 to 12 weeks the count doubles, she said, and I'd rather you've already tasted them before the volume is there than come to me after somebody else has already been in your door. Another pause. She could hear kitchen noise behind him. Drop some off Thursday morning, before 7. She was there at 6:45 with 24 eggs in the best cartons she had. A young cook took them at the back door without much ceremony, and she drove home not knowing what to expect. Marcus Webb called her 4 days later. The yolks, he said without preamble. What are you feeding them? She started to answer, and he interrupted. Don't tell me pasture-raised. Everyone says pasture-raised. What specifically? She told him. Feed composition, rotation schedule, mineral supplement, water source. He listened without speaking, and when she finished, there was a pause she couldn't read. I made a carbonara for the staff dinner Wednesday, he said. 4 of them asked me what was different. Norah let out a breath she'd been holding without realizing it. I can get you a weekly account started in January, she said. Volume will be limited, but consistent. What's limited? She told him. He said it was less than he needed. She said it would increase steadily over the following months if he was willing to work with her timeline. He said he didn't like timelines he couldn't control. She said she understood that, and she was telling him anyway because he deserved an honest picture. A silence. Then, January. We'll see where we are. She hung up and sat in the truck in the driveway for a moment, and she felt the specific kind of tired that comes not from failure, but from the enormous sustained effort of not failing, from holding something together through will and precision and the stubborn refusal to accept that the people who said it couldn't be done might have been right. Evan was coming out of the coop when she walked back up the path. Webb? He asked, because she'd mentioned the call. January, she said. He nodded. He didn't whoop or make a production of it. He just nodded, like it was the next reasonable step in something they were building together, and went back to what he'd been doing, which, she realized later, was exactly the right response. What she didn't know, couldn't have known on that cold December afternoon, was that the following week Harold Briggs would hear about the Tallow House conversation through whatever network of ears he maintained across the county, and that he would show up at Gene Alderman's feed store on a Tuesday morning and say something that would get back to her by Wednesday, which was that he'd looked into it and the Whitlock girl was running a hobby operation on borrowed time, and he gave her until spring to fold. She found out from Evan, who'd heard it from a woman at the hardware store, who'd heard it from her husband, who'd been at the feed store when it happened. He said spring, Evan told her, not looking up from the water line he was checking. Norah was quiet for a moment. What month is it now? December. Spring's 4 months away. Yep. She looked out of the pasture where 250-something hens moved through the pale December light, healthier than they'd been 2 months ago, orange-yolked and stronger, still not where they needed to be, but no longer where they'd started. Then we've got 4 months, she said. Evan didn't answer. He didn't need to. Inside the house, on the kitchen shelf, 11 of her grandfather's notebooks sat in order, and she still hadn't read the last 2. 4 months, she had told Evan. 4 months before Harold Briggs expected her to fold. She did not fold. But January tested her in ways she hadn't budgeted for, and not all of them were about money. The cold that settled into Blackbriar Hollow, the first week of the new year, was the kind that made the ground sound different underfoot, a hard, compressed silence that meant the frost had gone deep. Norah had prepared for cold. She'd insulated the coop walls with materials she and Evan had sourced from a demolition site 2 counties over, paying almost nothing for it because the contractor was happy to have someone haul it away. She'd fixed the roof properly in late December, a 4-day job she'd done mostly herself with Evan handling the materials from the ground, and it had held through everything since. The water system was winterized as well as she could manage on what she had. What she hadn't fully prepared for was the molt. A portion of the flock went into a late molt in the second week of January. Not all of them, and not on any schedule she'd anticipated. Birds that had been producing steadily suddenly stopped. Feathers everywhere. The egg count dropped from 118 back to 89, then to 71, and Norah stood in the coop on a Thursday morning looking at the count she'd marked in her composition book and felt the specific cold weight of a problem she could not will away. She had made a commitment to Marcus Webb for January. Modest volume, she'd told him. Consistent. Those two words had felt manageable in December. They felt considerably less manageable now. She called him before he could call her. "I need to talk to you about January volume," she said, and she said it straight, no preamble. A pause on his end. "How short?" "About 30% below what I told you." Silence. She could hear him breathing, which meant he was deciding something. Why? She explained the molt. She explained it in detail. What it was, why it happened, what it meant for the recovery timeline. She did not apologize excessively. She stated the facts and what she was doing about it, and when she expected the count to recover. "You could have not told me and just sent what you had," Marcus said. "I could have." "Why didn't you?" "Because then you'd have planned around a number I couldn't deliver, and you'd have had a problem in your kitchen instead of just a smaller order. That's not a trade I'm willing to make." Another silence, then, "Send what you have. We'll adjust the menu." He paused once more. "Next time something changes, call me before I have to wonder." "That's what I'm doing now." "I know," he said, and something in his voice had shifted slightly. Not warmer exactly, but differently calibrated. The way someone sounds when they've decided to take you seriously. He hung up. Norah set the phone down and exhaled and sat with the fact that she had just survived that conversation without losing the account, which was not the same as things being fine, but was considerably better than the alternative. She went back to the notebooks. The 10th notebook was the one that changed things. Not immediately, not in a way she could have explained to someone else in that first sitting, but the way certain information changes things by settling into you and rearranging how you see everything you've already been looking at. Her grandfather had been a methodical man, but his methodology had a direction to it that she'd only partially understood until the 10th notebook. The early ones were observational, what he noticed, what he tried, what worked. The middle ones were refinements. The 10th notebook was something else. It was the record of a deliberate project. He called it, in his own plain language, the selection effort. Starting roughly 28 years back, he had begun keeping very specific records on individual birds. Not just production numbers, but behavioral traits, recovery patterns after illness or stress, egg quality across seasons, mothering behavior, longevity. He had been selecting breeding pairs with the precision of someone who understood genetics intuitively, even if he'd never studied it formally. The goal, stated plainly in the first entry of the 10th notebook, was a line of birds that could thrive under real conditions, not forced conditions, not artificially sustained production environments, but actual land, actual weather, actual seasons, and produce quality that commercial methods couldn't replicate, because commercial methods required shortcuts that undermined the very qualities he was trying to preserve. He had a name for the line he was building. He called them the hollow birds, not as a brand, just as a way to distinguish them from anything bought elsewhere. Norah read that entry 3 times. Then she turned to the next page and the next, and she lost an hour in that kitchen without noticing the time passing, which almost never happened to her. The selection effort had taken decades. The 10th notebook documented the middle years of it, and from what she could piece together, by the time her grandfather died, he had been somewhere in the 3rd or 4th generation of deliberate selection. And the line was, the word he used was stabilizing, which in breeding terms meant the traits were becoming consistent, heritable, reliable. She sat back in the chair and looked at the window and thought about 300 spent hens in wire crates at a livestock auction, and she thought about the hen pressed against the wire with its head up, still watching. She thought about what her grandfather had written 30 years ago about the 16 birds that had survived a disease that killed most of the flock. The ones that survive what they shouldn't are the ones worth building from. She picked up the phone and called Esther. "The 10th notebook," she said when Esther answered. A pause that was slightly too long to be casual. "You read it. Why didn't you tell me?" "Tell you what specifically?" Esther's voice was careful. "About the selection effort. The hollow birds." The pause this time was longer. When Esther spoke, her voice had a quality Norah hadn't heard in it before. Not quite grief, but adjacent to it. "Because I wasn't sure," she said. "I knew what your grandfather was trying to do. I knew how long he'd been doing it. But when he died and the farm went quiet, and then you bought those hens from that auction," she stopped. "I didn't want to put a weight on you that you couldn't afford to carry. Not at the start. And now? Now you've read this notebook." A long exhale. "Norah, those birds at the auction, where did the auction house source them?" Norah had the paperwork somewhere. She'd kept everything. She found the auction receipt in the folder she'd made in the first week, and she looked at the lot number and the sourcing notation, and she felt something move through her that wasn't quite a word. The commercial operation that had discarded the flock was listed as a clearinghouse for several small farms in the region. One of the source farms on the lot documentation was listed as the Whitlock property in Blackbriar Hollow. The farm had been cleared out by the property manager her grandfather's estate had briefly retained before Norah came home. The manager had sold the flock, Dale Whitlock's flock, the selection effort, the hollow birds in whatever generation they'd reached, to a clearinghouse that had sold them into the commercial system, which had run them until they were spent and then put them in the auction. She sat at the table for a long time. The birds she had bought for $15 at the Caldwell County auction, the birds that the crowd had laughed about, the birds Harold Briggs had compared to graves waiting to be dug. They were her grandfather's life's work. They had gone through a commercial operation and come out the other side broken and discarded, and she had brought them home without knowing what she was bringing home, guided by something she couldn't have named at the auction, something that had made her raise her hand before her rational mind could stop her. She understood now, sitting in his kitchen, that what she'd felt looking at those birds was recognition, not conscious, deeper than that. When she told Evan the next morning, standing in the coop in the January cold with their breath-making small clouds, he was quiet for a moment. "So these birds," he said slowly, "were already yours." "My grandfather's. Same thing." He looked at the flock moving around them. "That changes things." "It changes what they are," she said. "It doesn't change what we have to do." "Which is the same." "Which is the same," she agreed. What it changed was the weight of the purpose. She had been working to recover a flock and build something viable. She was now working to recover something specific, something that represented decades of deliberate effort, and losing it again, to debt, to the cold, to the narrowing margin between what was coming in and what was going out, would mean losing it for good. That knowledge had an edge to it that she felt every morning when she checked the count. The molt ended gradually, the way those things do, the production ticking back up in small increments that you had to watch closely to see. By the end of January, the count was back to 110, and by mid-February it crossed 130 for the first time, which was the highest it had ever been. The quality metrics she tracked in her composition book, yolk color, shell integrity, white density, had all continued to improve steadily since November, trending in a direction that made the 10th notebook feel less like history and more like a promise. Patrice Dumont came back for her weekly order on a Tuesday in February and stood in the barn and watched the flock through the fence and said, "They look different than they did in November." "They are different than they were in November," Norah said. "Different how?" "Healthier, more settled. The recovery is holding." Patrice studied the birds a moment. "I had a customer last week ask me specifically where my eggs came from. That has never happened to me before." She turned from the fence. "I told her I hope that's all right." Norah felt something shift in the arithmetic of her situation, subtly but real. What did she want to know? If she could buy direct, I told her I didn't know. Patrice raised an eyebrow. Can she? The question opened a door Norah hadn't been standing in front of yet. Direct sales. Farm gate. No intermediary. Better margin. But also more time. More coordination. More of everything she was already running short of. Send her out, she said. I'll talk to her. The woman's name was Claire Sato, and she came on a Saturday with her adult daughter, and they stood in the driveway with the posture of people who had been to farmers' markets in larger cities and understood the vocabulary of what they were looking at. Claire asked smart questions. Not performative smart, actually smart, about rotation and feed and molt cycles, and Norah answered them plainly without dressing anything up, the way she'd answered Marcus Webb. Claire bought 4 dozen and said she'd be back the following week, and she'd probably bring her neighbor. She brought 3 neighbors. By the end of February, Norah had 7 direct customers driving out to the farm on Saturdays, and the Saturday morning rhythm had become a thing in itself. A 2-hour window when the farm received visitors, Evan managed the coop routine, and Norah stood at a folding table in the driveway and talked to people who had driven anywhere from 8 to 25 miles because they wanted eggs that tasted like something. The margin on direct sales was almost double what she made through the restaurant accounts. She didn't stop the restaurant accounts. She balanced them carefully, keeping Marcus Webb supplied at the volume she'd committed to, maintaining the Patrice arrangement, and letting the direct sales fill in around the edges. She wasn't making money yet. Not technically, but for the first time, the numbers on the paper showed a shape that looked like eventually rather than never. Harold Briggs heard about the Saturday sales within 3 weeks. She knew he'd heard because Gene Alderman mentioned it in a way that was trying to be casual and wasn't. Had a conversation with Harold about feed volumes the other day, Gene said, when she came in for her monthly order in early March. He mentioned you'd been having people come out to the farm. People come out on Saturdays, Norah said. Yes. Gene shifted his weight. He's wondering if you're competing in his accounts. She looked at Gene steadily. I'm not in any account Harold Briggs holds. I know that. I'm just... He stopped, seemed to reconsider. He asked me to keep him posted. On my business. Norah. You've known me since I was a kid, she said quietly. You knew my grandfather 40 years. I need you to tell me directly. Are you keeping Harold Briggs posted on my business? Gene Alderman had the look of a man standing between two things he didn't want to be between. He was not a bad man. That was the honest assessment. I was a man who had been in a small community long enough that his relationships had become a kind of debt structure he navigated carefully, and Harold Briggs was a very large debt. I haven't told him anything specific, Gene said. I wouldn't do that. Then tell him I said hello, Norah said, and paid for her order and left. She wasn't angry driving home. She was something more contained than anger, alert to something she should have been more alert to. Harold Briggs was not ignoring her. He had been monitoring her from the beginning, from the auction yard to the feed store conversation to this, and the monitoring had been casual as long as he thought she was failing. It was becoming less casual. That meant something had changed in his assessment. She told Evan that afternoon, and he thought about it for a moment. He's not going to do anything, Evan said. Not yet. If he does something now, he looks like he's threatened by somebody running a couple hundred hens. He is threatened, she said. Sure, but he can't look like it. Evan shrugged. Give it time. He'll try something when he thinks he has a reason that doesn't make him look small. It was a more sophisticated read than she would have expected from a 20-year-old, but she was learning that Evan Brooks had a particular talent for understanding how people positioned themselves. Maybe because he'd spent his childhood watching adults navigate power dynamics, he hadn't had the standing to influence. March brought rain, which the pasture needed badly, and which turned the access paths to mud that Norah tracked through the house constantly, despite her best efforts. The flock count had stabilized at 241 birds. She had lost more in the cold months than she'd hoped, and each loss still cost her something, though she'd gotten better at absorbing it without letting it spiral. The egg count was holding at 140, 150 on good days, and the quality was as consistent as it had ever been. She read the 11th notebook in March. The final one. The 11th notebook was different from the others in a way she noticed immediately. Her grandfather's handwriting was slightly less certain, not shaky, but more deliberate, like a man who knew he was writing for someone else to read rather than just for himself. The entries were more reflective, more explanatory. He described the hollow birds in the 11th notebook not as a project in progress, but as something he was trying to document for whoever came next. And reading that, Norah had to set the notebook down for a minute and look at the ceiling. He had known he was running out of time. He'd written the 11th notebook as a transfer of knowledge. The final entry was dated 8 months before he died. It described the current state of the selection effort, generation, estimated stability, traits that were holding, traits that still needed work. And at the bottom, in handwriting that was slower than usual, he had written something that was not about chickens at all. Whoever reads this will have already decided to try. Otherwise, they wouldn't be this far in. That's the only kind of person these birds will work for. Someone who decides before they know how it turns out. The rest will give up before the quality shows itself, which is exactly why the quality matters. She read that 3 times. Then she made a decision that she'd been circling for weeks without landing on. She was going to stop thinking of the flock as a recovery project and start thinking of it as what it actually was, a breeding population with 40 years of selection behind it that needed to move forward, not just survive. The birds she had were the fourth or fifth generation of Dale Whitlock's work. She needed to start a fifth or sixth, selecting with the same deliberateness he'd used, using the criteria he'd documented, adding what she'd learned in the months since October that the notebooks hadn't anticipated. She set up a section of the barn as a dedicated breeding area. It was rough, not equipped, not designed for the purpose, but functional. She spent 2 weeks selecting 20 pairs from the flock based on every quality metric she had, cross-referencing her own composition books with her grandfather's criteria. Evan helped without being asked to explain why, which was characteristic of him by now. "How do you know which ones?" he asked, watching her move through the flock. "Same way you know which plants in a garden are worth saving seeds from," she said. "Not the biggest, the most consistent. The ones that kept producing when the others dropped off. The ones who came through the molt and came back strong." She caught one hen and held her gently, checking weight and feather condition. "The ones that look like what they're supposed to look like even after everything." Evan watched her work. "Your grandfather figured this out over 40 years. He gave me a 40-year head start," she said. What she didn't say was that she was also afraid of getting it wrong, of misreading the criteria, of selecting for something that looked right but wasn't, of losing in one careless season what he'd spent decades building. The fear was real, and she sat with it instead of pretending it wasn't there, because pretending it wasn't there was how people made mistakes. April arrived, and with it the first serious challenge that didn't come from weather or money. It came from a truck she didn't recognize parked at the end of her driveway on a Thursday morning, and the man sitting inside it who was writing something in a notepad and watching the pasture. Evan noticed him first. "Been there about an hour," he said quietly, coming into the barn where Norah was working. "Who is it?" "Don't know. Truck has a commercial plate, but I can't read the company name from here." She walked out to the driveway. The man saw her coming and put his notepad down and got out of the truck, and he had the practiced casualness of someone who did not want to appear to be doing what he was doing. "Morning," he said. "Nice operation you've got here." She stopped at a distance that made it clear she wasn't coming closer. "Can I help you?" "Just passing through. Heard about the farm." He smiled. "Briggs Family Farms is actually looking to source some specialty product for a new line we're developing. High-quality pastured eggs, premium tier. We'd be interested in talking to local producers." She looked at him for a moment. "Harold Briggs sent you." Something flickered across his face. "I work for Briggs Family Farms, yes. Mr. Briggs is genuinely interested in buying my flock," she said. A pause. "In a partnership arrangement, potentially. He wants to buy what I have," she said. "Absorb the quality product into his operation and market it under his label." The man's smile became slightly less comfortable. "I don't think that's a fair characterization. This isn't a negotiation," she said. "Tell Mr. Briggs I'm not interested in partnerships or arrangements or any other word for the same thing. This flock is not for sale and this farm is not for sale." She held his eyes. "And if he sends someone to park at the end of my driveway again, I'll know what it means." The man left. Norah stood in the driveway for a minute after the truck disappeared around the bend, and she felt the cold clarity of understanding that the situation had moved into a different phase. Harold Briggs had gone from dismissing her to monitoring her to attempting to absorb her, and that sequence meant one specific thing. He had decided she was real. She went back into the barn, and she was shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of the confrontation, which she hadn't let show outside but couldn't quite contain inside. Evan was waiting. He read her face. "He tried to buy you out," he said, his version of it. "What are you going to do?" She picked up the composition book she'd set down and looked at the breeding records she'd been updating that morning. Pairs documented, eggs set, the slow, careful mathematics of building something generational. "What I've been doing," she said. The breeding program produced its first clutch of eggs in April. 23 eggs set, 17 hatched, 14 chicks survived the first 2 weeks. Small numbers, fragile, nothing that looked like a triumph from the outside. But Norah sat in the barn on the evening of the day the first 7 chicks hatched, watching them move under the heat lamp with the specific, unsteady energy of things that had just arrived in the world and didn't know yet what they were capable of, and she thought about her grandfather writing the 11th notebook for someone he'd never meet, trying to hand something forward across time. She thought about what it cost to believe in something you wouldn't live to see completed. She picked up her own composition book and wrote the date at the top of a new page, and she started documenting what she'd seen, what she'd done, what she'd chosen, and why, with the same plain deliberateness her grandfather had used. Not because she thought she was running out of time, because she understood now that this was how it worked. You documented so that the next person had a 40-year head start. You wrote it down and you kept going, and you trusted that what you were doing was worth the doing, even when you couldn't see the end of it from where you were standing. Outside in the April dark, the original flock moved quietly through the pasture, their orange yolks and strong shells the living record of everything that had survived long enough to matter. Inside the barn, under a heat lamp, 14 chicks that carried 40 years of careful selection in every cell of their small bodies pushed against each other in the warmth, and did not know yet what they were. But Norah knew. The 14 chicks grew. Not fast, not without setbacks. 2 of them didn't make it past the 3rd week, one from what looked like a developmental issue, one from a cause she couldn't determine even after checking everything she could think to check. She recorded both losses in the composition book with the same plain notation her grandfather had used, date and circumstance and what she observed, no additional commentary. The grief of small losses, she had learned, was best absorbed by documentation rather than analysis, because analysis implied there was something she could have done differently, and sometimes there simply wasn't. The remaining 12 grew into the most interesting young birds she'd seen since she'd started paying close attention to such things. They moved differently from the purchased flock, more deliberate, more curious without being high-strung, with a quality of attention to their environment that she recognized from her grandfather's descriptions in the 10th notebook. He had called it ground sense, his own term for the way a well-bred foraging bird engaged with the land it was on, not just moving across it, but reading it, working it, using it in a way that suggested an old relationship between the animal and the soil rather than a forced one. She watched the young birds in the pasture on an early May morning, and she thought that if the word legacy had a sound, it would probably sound like what she was hearing, the particular rhythm of 12 young hens moving through real grass with their heads down and their purpose clear. May was also the month the county agricultural fair sent out its exhibitor packets. Norah almost threw hers in the recycling. It had been addressed to the property rather than to her specifically, probably because her grandfather had exhibited there for decades, and the mailing list still carried the farm address. She'd pulled it out of the box automatically and set it on the kitchen counter and ignored it for 3 days, and then on the 4th day she picked it up because something had been nagging at her, and she wasn't entirely sure what. The fair's livestock and agricultural products division had a category she hadn't expected: heritage and specialty eggs. She read the submission criteria twice: quality assessment, yolk color grading, shell integrity testing, breed documentation if available. She set the packet down. She picked it up again. "You're thinking about it," Evan said from the doorway. He'd developed a habit of reading her expressions that she'd stopped being surprised by. "I don't know what I'm thinking about." "The fair packet's been on the counter for 3 days and you keep almost throwing it away." He came in and poured himself coffee from the pot she'd made at 5. "Enter." "I'm not ready for that." "Ready for what?" "You're not competing against other farms." He leaned against the counter. "You're putting your eggs in front of people who don't know what good eggs look like. That's not a competition. That's an education." She looked at him. "When did you get opinions about marketing?" "I've always had opinions about marketing. You just didn't ask." He shrugged. "Enter. Worst case, nothing happens. Best case, the right person sees them." She entered. Not confidently. With the specific reluctance of someone who has been building something privately and understands that making it public changes the nature of it in ways that can't be undone. She filled out the forms and documented the flock with the breeding records she had, which were impressively detailed for an operation of her size, and she submitted 3 dozen eggs in the best cartons she had, which were still the simple cardboard ones with her handwritten label. She did not tell anyone except Evan and Esther. Esther's response was characteristically dry. "About time," she said on the phone. "Your grandfather exhibited for 20 years before people understood what they were looking at. You might move faster. Or I might get the same result he did, and nobody pays attention." "Then you exhibit again next year," Esther said. "That's how it works." The fair was the third weekend in May. Norah went on Saturday, not to stand beside her exhibit and solicit attention, but to see it in context, to understand how it sat among the other entries, and to gather information about what the judges valued. She walked the agricultural hall twice before she let herself stop at the heritage and specialty category, and what she saw when she got there was both better and worse than she'd expected. Better, because her eggs were visually distinct from everything around them in ways that a non-specialist could see without being told. The yolk color in the open display sample was the deepest orange in the case by a considerable margin. The shells had a matte warmth that commodity eggs didn't carry. Worse, because the farm 3 slots to her left had a professional display, printed signage, breed history panels, a photograph spread of their operation that made her handwritten label look like what it was. Someone who hadn't done this before. She stood there looking at the display for a moment with the familiar feeling of having shown up with less than everyone else and having to decide what to do about that. She decided it didn't matter. The eggs were what they were, regardless of the signage around them. She left without lingering and drove home and fed the flock and did not think too hard about the results, which would be posted Sunday and which she was not going to the fair to see in person because she had work to do and the work didn't pause for ribbons. Evan called her Sunday afternoon. Second place. She was in the middle of checking the breeding records. Overall? Heritage category, second place overall, and a judge's commendation for yolk quality consistency, which is apparently a separate thing they give when something stands out specifically. She was quiet for a moment. Who took first? Operation out of Millhaven. 12 years exhibiting, 300 acres, professional setup. He paused. Their eggs looked worse than yours. Second place is honest, she said. Second place to people who've been doing it 12 years with 300 acres is not second place, Evan said, and his voice had the flat certainty of someone stating an obvious fact to a person who is being unnecessarily modest. It means you were first and you didn't have a good sign. She didn't argue. She sat with it instead, the way she'd learned to sit with things, not dismissing them, not overreading them, letting the actual meaning settle before she decided what to do with it. What she did with it was make a sign. Evan helped. It took 2 evenings and a piece of plywood and paint she found in the barn, and it was not professional, but it was legible, and it said what it needed to say. Whitlock Hollow Farm. Pasture-raised eggs. Heritage flock. She put it at the end of the driveway on Friday before the Saturday sale and stood back and looked at it. It looked like a farm sign. That was all she wanted it to look like. The Saturday after the fair brought 14 cars instead of the usual 7 or 8. She ran out of eggs by 9:30 in the morning, which had never happened before. Several people had driven out specifically because of the fair result. Word had moved through the kind of networks that food-interested people maintain, the informal ones that operate through restaurant conversations and Saturday market talk, and the specific social energy of people who care about what they eat and want to tell other people about what they've found. One of those people was a woman named Diane Cho, who ran a specialty food column for a regional publication that covered 3 counties. She came at 9 and bought what Norah had left, which was less than a dozen, and stood in the driveway asking questions with the focused attention of someone who was already writing in her head. Norah answered the way she always answered, plainly, specifically, without embellishment. She described the flock history the way she understood it by then, her grandfather's selection program, the commercial disruption, the recovery. She described the breeding program she'd started. She didn't frame any of it as a story. She just described what had happened and what she was doing and why. Diane Cho listened with the stillness of someone who had heard a lot of people try to make themselves interesting and was currently encountering something that was interesting without trying. "Can I photograph the flock?" she asked. "Next Saturday," Norah said. "I'm out of time this morning." Diane Cho came back the following Saturday with a camera and spent 2 hours on the property, and the piece she wrote ran 6 weeks later in the regional publication under a headline Norah hadn't been consulted on and wouldn't have chosen herself. But the piece was accurate, surprisingly, carefully accurate, and it described the flock and the breeding program and the history in terms that were accessible without being condescending, and it named the farm and mentioned the Saturday sales and included a quote from Marcus Webb at Tallow House that Diane had apparently gotten by calling him without asking Norah first. The quote from Marcus was, "I've been cooking professionally for 14 years, and I've learned to trust what the eggs tell me. These tell me something most ingredients don't anymore. She read the piece at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning when Evan dropped the publication off, and she read Marcus's quote twice, and she felt something she was not prepared to name out loud, but which had the particular quality of being seen accurately by someone she respected. The Saturday after the piece ran, she ran out of eggs by 8:45. She had to turn people away. She stood at the folding table and told people she was out and she was sorry and they could come next week, and several of them left phone numbers and asked to be put on a list, which she wrote on a piece of notebook paper because she didn't have a system for it yet. She had 17 names by 9 in the morning, and Evan was looking at her from across the yard with an expression that said something had crossed a threshold. She called Esther that evening. "You need a waiting list," Esther said before Norah finished describing the morning. "I have a waiting list written on notebook paper. A real one, and you need to think about volume." "I know." She leaned back in the kitchen chair. "The breeding program's first generation won't be producing for another 4 months minimum. I can't rush that." "No," Esther agreed, "but you could add birds." "Not from the outside." The answer came before she'd consciously articulated the reasoning, but the reasoning was clear. Adding commercial stock to what she was building would dilute the selection work. It would solve a short-term problem by creating a long-term one that her grandfather's notebooks were full of warnings about. "It has to come from the breeding program." Esther was quiet for a moment. "He would have agreed with that," she said. "I know. It means turning people away for a while longer." "It means turning people away for as long as it takes," Norah said. "That's what it means." She built the waiting list properly that week. A simple notebook she kept on the kitchen counter, names and phone numbers, and how they'd heard about the farm. Within 2 weeks, the list had 41 names. Within a month, it had 63. She called each one personally when she had availability, which she did not have often, and the personal call turned out to matter to people in a way she hadn't anticipated. Several of them mentioned it, that she'd called herself, that she remembered who they were, that she treated a dozen eggs like it was a transaction worth the human attention. It was. That was simply her position on the matter. June brought the heat, and with it a new complication she hadn't seen coming, which was the specific form of stress that arrived when things were going well, but not well enough, and the gap between the two felt like it might close and might not. She was paying her bills. She was not accumulating anything. The breeding program was progressing, but slowly, and every week she turned away names on the waiting list was a week. The momentum she'd built could potentially stall. She was also watching Esther with increasing attention. The older woman had been thinner since winter. Nothing dramatic, the kind of gradual thing that you only noticed if you saw someone regularly and paid close attention, which Norah did. Esther moved more carefully than she had in October. She didn't mention it, and Norah didn't ask directly because asking directly would have required Esther to either lie or acknowledge something she was clearly not ready to acknowledge, and neither outcome served either of them. Instead, Norah brought eggs every Sunday and stayed longer than she needed to, and she let the visits run into the afternoon, and she listened to everything Esther told her about the farm and the notebooks and the history, because she understood, without anyone saying so, that the window in which she could learn these things from the person who had lived them was not unlimited. It was on a Sunday in late June that Harold Briggs came to the farm. Not a representative, not a man in a truck with a notepad. Harold Briggs himself, in a vehicle that cost more than Norah's annual operating budget, arriving at 11 in the morning on a Saturday when she was still running the sale. She saw him park and get out, and she felt the current in the air change the way it changes before a weather system comes through. Not a dramatic shift, just a pressure difference that your body registers before your mind processes it. He waited until the last customer had left. She gave him that he stood by his vehicle and didn't interrupt her business, which was either courtesy or calculation, and she wasn't sure which. "Miss Whitlock," he said when she walked toward him. "Mr. Briggs." He was older up close than he'd looked at the auction. Mid-60s, she estimated, with the deliberate posture of a man who had been physically imposing once and maintained the habit of it even as the substance shifted. He looked at the driveway, at the farm sign Evan had painted, at the coop visible beyond the fence. "You've built something," he said. It wasn't what she expected. She didn't answer. "I was wrong about you at the auction," he said. The words came out flat and evenly paced, like a man reciting something he'd decided to say before he arrived, but making the decision to say it anyway. I've been wrong about a few things since then. I'd rather say that directly than not. She studied him. What do you want, Mr. Briggs? He exhaled. I want to offer you the Hendricks parcel. 22 acres on the North Ridge. I acquired it last fall. You probably know the land. He paused. No charge. Use it. Expand your pasture rotation. Whatever you need it for. No strings attached. The silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. Why? She said. He looked at her steadily. Because I've been in this business for 30 years, and I stopped paying attention to what the product actually is about 15 years ago, and what you're doing out here is reminding me what it was supposed to be. He stopped. And because I embarrassed you at that auction in front of people who still talk about it, and I was wrong, and I have some land that could be useful to you. Norah stood very still. She thought about the man in the truck at the end of her driveway in April. She thought about Harold Briggs in Gene Alderman's feed store, talking about her odds. She thought about the auction yard and the laughter and the specific weapon of the word sweetheart deployed at volume in a crowd. She also thought about the Hendricks parcel, which she knew. She had walked that ridge with her grandfather as a child. The soil was good, deep and well-drained, with the kind of mineral composition that her grandfather had noted in his early notebooks as ideal for the rotation system he'd been developing. 22 acres would double her viable pasture capacity. It would mean the breeding program's first generation wouldn't have to compete with the original flock for ground. It would change the timeline for everything. She hated that it would change the timeline for everything. I need to think about it, she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not disappointment exactly, more like respect, which she suspected he didn't feel for people easily. Fair enough. I have one question. All right. The man you sent out here in April, she said. The one with the notepad. He didn't look away. Mistake, he said. I was still thinking about this wrong. And now? Now I'm standing here telling you that. Make of it what you want. He put his card on the folding table at the end of the driveway. The folding table with the empty egg cartons and the notebook paper waiting list and the plywood sign behind it. Take your time. He drove away. Evan came out of the barn where he'd clearly been listening to the whole thing. He didn't pretend he hadn't been. What are you going to do? He said. I don't know yet. The land is real, he said. The Hendricks parcel is real. I've seen it. I know the land is real. Then what's the problem? She looked at where Briggs's vehicle had gone around the bend. The problem is that taking something from someone who tried to undermine you is complicated even when the thing itself is useful. Evan thought about it. What would your grandfather do? She picked up the empty egg cartons and stacked them. He would say that the land doesn't know where it came from. Only the person farming it does. She stacked the last carton. And he'd say that letting pride cost you 22 good acres was exactly the kind of decision that looks righteous and is actually just expensive. She called Esther that evening. She described the conversation in detail, and Esther listened without interrupting, which was unusual enough to mean she was thinking carefully. Take the land, Esther said when Norah finished. That simple? Nothing about it is simple, but it's the right thing to do. A pause. Your grandfather once told me that the hardest part of building something real is accepting help from imperfect people without letting it make what you've built feel less yours. She paused again. He had to do that twice. Both times it was the right call. Norah called Harold Briggs the next morning and told him she would accept the parcel with one condition, that the arrangement was documented formally, no encumbrances, no reversionary clauses, no fine print that gave him any future claim on the operation. That's fair, he said, without negotiating. My attorney will draft it, she said, which was technically true in that she would find an attorney to draft it, which she had not previously had cause to need. She found one in town, a woman named Sandra Park, who handled agricultural real estate, and who, when Norah explained the situation, said, Harold Briggs is giving you land for nothing? And then was quiet for a moment and then said, All right, let me see what he's offering. The papers were clean. Sandra reviewed them twice and found nothing that shouldn't be there, which surprised her enough that she mentioned it. Clean as I've ever seen from a commercial operation, Sandra said. He either feels very guilty about something or he's trying to restore a reputation. Both, Norah said. Probably both. She signed the papers on a Thursday in July, and on the Saturday of that week she drove up to the Hendricks parcel with Evan, and they walked the 22 acres in the early morning, through the long grass and the old elderberry trees along the north fence line, and the ground was everything her grandfather's notebooks had suggested it would be. This is where the next generation goes, Evan said, half to himself, standing on the ridge looking down at the farm below. This is where the next generation goes, she agreed. She did not feel triumphant. Triumph was too clean for what she felt. What she felt was something more complicated. The awareness that this land had been obtained through a sequence of events that had included real humiliation and real struggle and real imperfect people doing imperfect things, and that the result was real and useful and would make the work possible in ways it hadn't been before, and that this was how most things worth having actually arrived, not clean and deserved and obvious, but sideways and complicated, and requiring you to decide whether the discomfort of the path invalidated the value of the destination. She decided it didn't. She walked the fence line with Evan and started planning where the new rotation sections would go, talking through the logistics in the practical, unromantic way of people who have too much to do to spend much time on what it all means. What it meant could wait. The work, as always, could not. Back at the farm that evening, she went to the barn and checked on the first-generation birds, now months old and developing in ways that confirmed everything she'd hoped to see. She checked the breeding records. She wrote in the composition book. She marked the date, which was a Thursday in the middle of summer, unremarkable, except for the 22 acres that were now part of the operation and the slow, accumulating weight of things going in the right direction. She went inside and found Esther's most recent note on the kitchen table. The old woman had taken to leaving notes when she visited during the week, since Norah was often outside, and the note said only, "Read the last page of Notebook 11 again. I think you're ready to understand it now." She sat at the table and opened the 11th notebook to the last page. She read her grandfather's final entry again, the one about deciding before you know how it turns out. She had read it in March as a message about persistence. Now in July, she read it differently. It wasn't about persistence. It was about inheritance, about the specific way that doing something well enough passes something forward, not just in product or in land or in flock genetics, but in the quality of attention itself, in the habit of watching, in the willingness to sit with a problem long enough to understand it instead of forcing a solution that fit the timeline instead of the truth. She closed the notebook. Outside in the summer dark, 300 and some birds settled into the roost with the sounds of a flock that had learned where it belonged, and 12 young hens from the first breeding cycle moved through the pasture one last time before night, carrying in their unremarkable small bodies 40 years of careful work and a summer's worth of her own. And somewhere on the North Ridge, 22 acres of good ground waited for what she was building to grow into it. The summer moved the way summers do when you're working too hard to track them. Not slowly, not quickly, just continuously, one day folding into the next with the particular relentlessness of a season that doesn't care about your schedule. Norah expanded the rotation onto the Hendricks parcel in August. It took 3 weeks of fencing work, most of it done by her and Evan, with one borrowed post driver and more manual labor than either of them cared to calculate afterward. The North Ridge ground was everything the notebooks had promised, deep, mineral-rich, with a natural drainage pattern that kept it from waterlogging in heavy rain, and a grass composition that her grandfather had noted 40 years ago as ideal. She could see, walking the new sections after the first birds moved through them, why he had wanted that land. Why he'd probably looked at it over the fence for years, knowing what it would do for the rotation if he ever had access to it. She didn't spend time on the irony of how she'd gotten it. The land was good. That was what mattered now. The first-generation birds from the spring breeding program came into lay in September. 12 hens, all descended from the pairs she'd selected in March, and the first eggs they produced made her sit down on a hay bale in the barn and look at them in the light from the open door for longer than was strictly necessary. The yolks were deeper than the original flock. Not dramatically. You'd have to put them side by side to see it clearly, but measurably, and more important than the color was the consistency. Egg to egg, bird to bird, the quality held in a way that even the best of the original flock couldn't quite match, because the original flock was recovered, rebuilt, stabilized. But the first generation had been bred deliberately from the best of what the recovery had produced. They were the next chapter of what her grandfather had started writing 30 years ago, and the eggs they laid were the evidence that the chapter was proceeding the way it was supposed to. She documented everything, The composition book for September was the most detailed she'd kept since she started, with measurements and observations that would have looked obsessive to anyone who didn't understand what they represented. She understood what they represented. She wrote it all down with the same plain handwriting her grandfather had used, in the same kind of composition book, on the same kitchen table where he'd written his. She mailed copies of the key entries to Esther every week. Esther was not well. That was the honest way to say it, and by September Norah had stopped finding gentler phrasings because the gentler phrasings were just a way of not looking at something directly, and she'd spent the better part of a year learning not to look away from things that were hard to see. Esther was 81 years old and had been slowing down since winter, and by September she wasn't driving herself anymore, which was the specific change that told Norah what she needed to know about the direction things were moving. She drove out twice a week instead of once, Sundays still, for the longer visits where they would eat and talk and go through whatever she'd brought to show Esther, breeding records, egg samples, photos Evan had taken of the Northridge flock. And Thursdays, for shorter visits where she mostly just sat in the kitchen and helped with whatever needed helping and let Esther talk if she wanted to talk and didn't push if she didn't. Esther talked on the Thursdays more than Norah had expected. Not about the farm always, about other things, about growing up with Dale, about the particular difficulty of watching a sibling do something you couldn't quite keep up with, even when you understood exactly what they were doing. About the farm's history and the family that went further back than the notebooks, into a time before documentation, when the knowledge had been passed orally and had nearly been lost twice before Dale decided to start writing it down. He was afraid, Esther said, on a Thursday in late September. They were at the kitchen table with coffee, and the afternoon light was coming through the window at the angle that made the room feel older than it was, like a photograph of itself. He never said that directly, but that's what the notebooks were. He was afraid that if he didn't write it down, it would die when he did. He was right to be afraid, Norah said. He was. And he was right to write it down. Esther wrapped her hands around her mug. But there's a limit to what notebooks can hold. The rest of it has to be lived, and you can't write that part down until after you've lived it. Norah looked at her. What part is that? The judgment part. Esther's eyes were clear and direct in the way they always had been, the part of her that the year hadn't touched. When to hold, when to let go. When the bird in front of you is worth keeping, and when you're holding on to something because you're afraid to lose it, not because it's actually worth preserving. That part can't be taught from a notebook. You just have to be around long enough to develop the eye. Do I have the eye? Norah asked. It was a genuine question, not fishing for reassurance. Esther thought about it with the deliberateness the question deserved. You have the beginning of it, she said, which is more than most people ever develop, and more than I was afraid you'd have when you first came home. She paused. You had it at the auction, actually, that moment when you raised your hand. That was the eye operating before your brain had caught up with it. Norah thought about the hen pressed against the wire with its head up, still watching, still not having given up. I didn't know what I was looking at, she said. The eye doesn't need to know, Esther said. That's what makes it different from just thinking. In October, Diane Cho came back. Not for a story this time. She came on a Saturday morning with a man she introduced as a colleague from a regional food journal that had significantly wider circulation than the publication where her first piece had run. And she explained, standing in the driveway while Norah finished with a waiting list customer, that the colleague had read her original piece and had been persistent enough about it that she'd agreed to bring him out. His name was Robert Finch. He was in his 40s, professionally skeptical in the way that food journalists who have seen a lot of carefully constructed farm narratives sometimes become. And he looked at the farm the way Norah had learned to look at things. Not at the surface, but at the evidence of what was actually happening. He spent 2 hours on the property. He asked questions that went beyond what Diane had asked. Questions about breeding records, about the selection criteria, about the sourcing history of the original flock that she'd pieced together from the auction documentation and the notebooks. She showed him the composition books, not all of them, but the current ones, the breeding records and the quality logs. She showed him the first-generation birds on the North Ridge. He was quiet for a long time after she finished talking. The commercial operation that cleared the original flock, he said finally. Do you know if they understood what they had? No, she said. I don't think so. I don't think anyone who understood what they had would have run them the way they did. And you bought them without knowing. Without knowing consciously, she said carefully. Something else was going on. I can't explain it better than that. Robert Finch looked at the North Ridge where the first-generation birds were moving through the late morning light. I've been doing this a long time, he said. I've seen a lot of farms with a good story. This is a different thing. I'm not trying to sell you a story, she said. I know, he said. That's what makes it different. His piece ran in November. It was longer than Diane's, more detailed, and it placed the farm in a context that Norah hadn't thought to place it in herself. The broader pattern of heritage breed preservation, the agricultural knowledge that had been lost during the industrialization of food production, the specific and increasingly rare phenomenon of a multi-generational breeding program surviving commercial pressures. He quoted her directly, accurately, and he quoted Marcus Webb again and Patrice Dumont, both of whom had apparently been willing to go on record in terms considerably more emphatic than anything they'd said to her directly. Marcus's quote this time was longer. He described serving a dish at Tallow House where the egg was the primary ingredient, not a supporting element, and watching the reaction of a table of food professionals who had visited from out of state and who had not expected to find what they found in a county they were passing through. Patrice said simply that she no longer bought eggs from any other source and had stopped apologizing for the premium she charged, because customers who tasted the difference stopped asking about the price. The waiting list, which had sat at 63 names through the summer, reached 112 within 2 weeks of the piece running, then 140. Then Norah stopped checking it daily because the number had passed the point where the precise figure was useful information. She called Sandra Park. I need to talk about the business structure, she said. What I have now is going to stop being adequate. Sandra came out the following week and they sat at the kitchen table with the budget sheets and the account records and the waiting list notebook and the breeding program documentation. And Sandra went through it with the careful attention of someone who understood agricultural economics and was doing the math on what Norah had actually built. Sandra set her pen down after a while and looked up. Do you know how unusual this is? I know what it cost, Norah said. That's not what I meant. Sandra tapped the breeding records. A documented heritage program with this kind of quality consistency at this point in the development, there are people in the specialty food industry who have been looking for this for years. Not for what you have right now, for what you're going to have in 2 more generations. I'm not selling the program, Norah said immediately. I'm not suggesting you sell it. I'm suggesting you understand what it's worth, which is different. Sandra picked up the pen again. Here's what I think you need. A proper LLC structure. A tiered account system. Restaurant accounts at one price. Direct sales at another. And a third category for what you're going to eventually have when the second generation comes into full production. And a waiting list that functions like a membership, with a small deposit that confirms commitment and gives you predictable forward revenue. Norah listened. She pushed back on 2 points and agreed on the rest, and Sandra left with enough to draft the structure. Norah sat at the table after she left and looked at the notebook with 140 names in it and thought about October 2 years ago. The auction yard, the $15, the laughter that had followed her out to the parking lot and ridden home with her in the cab of the truck. She thought about it without drama. It was simply what had happened, and what had happened had led to what was happening now, which was a farm with a documented heritage breeding program and a waiting list of 140 people and a business structure that needed to become more formal because the informal version was no longer sufficient. That was all it was. That was the whole distance between those 2 points. She was still sitting there when Evan knocked and came in, which was his habit now after 2 years of working closely enough together that the professional distance had collapsed into something more like the relationship she imagined having a younger brother would feel like if she'd had one. The second clutch numbers are in, he said. He had a composition book in his hand, his own, which she'd suggested he start keeping in the spring, and which he'd done without much comment and with the kind of consistency that told her it had found a natural place in how he thought about the work. He set it on the table and showed her the numbers. 41 eggs from the second breeding cycle, 36 hatched, 30 viable at 2 weeks. The mortality rate was lower than the first clutch, which was the direction it was supposed to move. She looked at the numbers. Shell integrity on the new clutch? Highest I've measured yet, across the board. Color? Same. He sat down across from her. The second generation is going to be better than the first. It's supposed to be, she said. That's what selection means. I know what it means. He looked at the composition book. I'm saying it's actually happening. which is different from it being supposed to happen. She met his eyes across the table. He had the particular look of someone who had been involved in building something from the beginning and was watching it become what it was always trying to be. And the feeling attached to that look was one she recognized because she had been living inside it for 2 years. "Yeah," she said, "it's different." Esther fell in early November. Not badly. That was what the neighbor who called Norah said. Not badly. She's all right. She didn't hit her head. But the fall itself was less important than what it confirmed, which was that Esther Hale could no longer live in the house on Route 9 by herself and expect things to continue to be fine. Norah drove out that afternoon and sat with her, and they didn't argue about it because Esther, for all her sharpness, was not a woman who wasted energy fighting against things that were true. "I'm going to my daughter's in March," Esther said. "Paula's been asking since spring, and I've been ignoring her because I didn't want to leave in the middle of things." She looked at Norah with the directness that was her most consistent quality. "You're not in the middle of things anymore, you're past the middle." "I don't know if that's true," Norah said. "It is. The hard part is done. Not the work. The work is never done. But the hard part. The part where everything might collapse, and probably won't, but might." She paused. "That part is done." Norah sat with that. "What if I have questions? Things I don't know yet that I won't know I don't know until I need to know them? Then you'll figure them out the same way you figured out everything else." Esther's voice was dry, but her eyes were not. "I didn't know everything your grandfather knew. I know different things. You know different things than I know. That's how it works. The knowledge isn't supposed to be identical. It's supposed to grow." She reached across the table and put her hand over Norah's briefly. Not a long gesture. Esther was not a person of long gestures. And then took it back and picked up her coffee mug. "Now," she said, "tell me about the second clutch numbers." Norah told her. Esther listened with the same focused attention she'd given the farm in every conversation for 2 years, asking the specific questions that came from decades of understanding what mattered and what didn't. And Norah answered them and wrote down 3 things Esther said that she hadn't thought to write before. They sat in the kitchen until the light failed, and then Norah made dinner from what was in Esther's refrigerator, which wasn't much, and they ate and didn't talk about March or Paula's house or what it meant for a woman of 81 to leave the home she'd lived in for 40 years. They talked about the North Ridge and the mineral composition of the soil and what the second generation's production numbers might look like at full maturity, and it was enough, and it was the right thing to talk about. On the drive home, in the dark of the November road, with the truck heater doing its clicking thing, Norah let herself feel the approaching loss without trying to organize it into something useful. Esther wasn't gone yet. She was going to Paula's house in March, not away from the world, and phone calls would still be possible, and visits would still happen. But the shape of things was changing, and Norah had learned well enough by now that acknowledging the shape of things, however uncomfortable the shape was always better than pretending it wasn't there. She had also learned, though she wouldn't have been able to say exactly when she learned it, that loss and inheritance weren't opposites. They were the same transaction, viewed from different directions. December came. The farm went into its second winter, and this time Norah moved through the preparations with a competence she hadn't had the first year. Not ease, because the work was still hard and the cold was still cold, but a competence that came from having done it once and having noted every mistake and not making the same ones again. The coop was better insulated, the water system was properly winterized, the feed inventory was managed with more precision, the breeding area in the barn was warmer and better organized, and the second-generation birds were settled into it with the kind of calm that came from being handled correctly from the beginning. The waiting list had reached 160 by December. She had stopped accepting new names because adding names she couldn't serve in any foreseeable timeline wasn't honest, and she had enough of a list to work from already. She called Sandra Park, and they finalized the membership structure, and Sandra sent letters to the top 40 names on the list, explaining the program and asking for a small deposit to confirm their place, and 37 of the 40 responded within a week. 37 people who had never been to the farm, who had heard about it secondhand or read about it in a publication, who were willing to put money down for eggs that didn't exist yet from a flock that was still developing, because they trusted what the reputation said the product would be. Norah held that thought for a while. Not with pride exactly, but with the specific gravity of understanding what it meant, that the thing she'd been building had become real enough that people believed in it without being able to hold it yet. That was a different kind of thing from just having customers. That was a farm with a name that meant something. She wrote it in the composition book, not because it needed to be recorded for operational purposes, because it was the kind of thing her grandfather would have written down. January of the second year was different from January of the first in almost every measurable way. The egg count was at 180 and holding. The breeding program was into its second generation and performing above the metrics she'd set. The accounts, tallow house, the hollow table, the 7 direct customers who'd been coming since the beginning, and the new membership program were balanced in a way that showed clear forward revenue. The property tax was paid in full, on time, without emergency calls to anyone. The truck had been serviced. The roof was solid. She was not wealthy. She was not operating at scale. She was running a small farm with one paid farmhand and a breeding program that was still years from its full potential, and she had more demand than she could meet, and a waiting list she'd closed, and a business structure that would take another full year to operate efficiently. But she was not failing. She had not failed. The spring Harold Briggs had given her was almost 18 months behind her, and she was still here, and the farm was more than it had been when he said that. And the person who had said it had since given her 22 acres and stood in her driveway and said he'd been wrong. She thought about that particular reversal sometimes, not with the satisfaction of revenge, but with the more complicated feeling of understanding that Harold Briggs had not been a villain in the straightforward sense. He'd been a man with a fixed idea of how things worked, who had encountered something that didn't fit his model and had reacted by dismissing it, because dismissing things you don't understand is considerably easier than updating your understanding. He had eventually done the harder thing. She didn't feel the need to make more of that than it was, but she didn't feel the need to diminish it either. People were capable of revision. That was something the year had taught her that she hadn't known going in. The moment she understood the story was over. Not finished, farms don't finish, but over in the sense of having resolved into something stable, came on a morning in late January when she was standing in the North Ridge pasture watching the second-generation birds move through the frost-pale grass. She was alone. Evan was at the coop on the lower property. The morning was still enough that she could hear her own breathing. The birds moved through the field with the ground sense that her grandfather had described, and she had watched develop over 2 years, and they were beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they are precisely what they are supposed to be. Not more, not less, not performing, just existing fully in their function. She had her composition book in her jacket pocket. She took it out and looked at the cover, which was worn now from 6 months of daily use, its edges soft and its spine slightly sprung. Then she looked at the birds. She thought about a man sitting at a kitchen table 30 years ago, writing in a composition book by lamplight, because he was afraid that what he knew would die when he did, and he needed to find a way to hand it forward. She thought about what it cost him, the decades, the failures, the patience required to work on something whose outcome you would not live to see. She thought about the specific faith required to do that, not faith in any external source, but faith in the work itself, in the idea that doing something carefully enough and long enough produces something real that outlasts the person doing it. She thought about $15 at a livestock auction, and a crowd laughing, and a hen pressed against wire with its head up. She opened the composition book to a fresh page and wrote the date at the top, and then she wrote, Second Generation, North Ridge, First Full Winter Morning. Count, 30. Movement, purposeful. Ground engagement, high. Shell trend from early sample, thickness improved 14% over first generation at same age. Yolk color, deepest yet measured. She paused. Then, below the technical notes, she wrote something she hadn't written in any of the previous books, something that wasn't operational, wasn't documentation, wasn't the kind of thing that needed to be there for the next person to understand the breeding program. She wrote, I think he knew someone would come back for them. I don't know how, but I think he knew. She closed the book and put it in her pocket and stood in the frost-pale field for another minute, listening to the birds and the wind through the old elderberry trees along the north fence line and the specific silence of a winter morning on land that is being cared for by someone who understands what it is. Then she went back to work. The second winter was hard in its own ways, different from the first. Not the desperate hardness of survival, but the grinding hardness of maintenance, of sustaining what you've built through conditions that don't care what you've built. There were days she was tired in a way that sleep didn't fix. Days when Evan was short with her and she was short back, and they worked 3 hours in the same barn without speaking, not out of anger, but out of the particular fatigue of two people who have been doing hard work in close proximity for long enough that the pleasantries have worn off, and what's left is just the work and the willingness to keep doing it. Those days were not failures. They were just what sustained effort actually felt like when you stripped away the parts of the story where everything is moving forward and acknowledged the parts where you are mostly just holding on. She called Esther every Sunday through January and February. The calls were shorter than they used to be. Esther tired more easily now, and they had both made an unconscious agreement to use the time efficiently, to say the things that mattered, and not pat around them. Esther asked about the birds, always, and Norah told her. And then Esther would say something that wasn't about birds at all, but that Norah would find herself thinking about for days afterward. The last call before Esther left for Paula's house in March was on a Sunday evening, and it was shorter than usual. Esther sounded tired. They talked about the second-generation egg data, and then there was a pause that was comfortable in the way that silences between people who have said most of what they needed to say can be comfortable. "You did it," Esther said. Norah didn't answer immediately. "I'm still doing it." "I know, but you did the part I was worried about." A pause. "I wasn't sure when you came home. You had the instinct, but instinct alone doesn't hold anything together for long. You needed the patience too, and that part I didn't know." "I didn't know either," Norah said. "No," Esther agreed. "That's the part that can't be given to you in advance." There was a moment of quiet. "The notebooks," Esther said then, with the careful tone of someone saying something they've thought about for a long time. "There's a page in the 11th one, near the back, separate from the main entries, not dated." Norah went to the shelf and pulled the 11th notebook and found what Esther meant. Near the back, on a page she had seen but had read as a stray note, something she hadn't been able to decode the first time. It was a list, 12 items. Each one was a characteristic, not a production characteristic, not a breeding metric, but a quality characteristic. Qualities of attention, ways of seeing, the capacity to wait, the willingness to sit with uncertainty without collapsing it prematurely, the ability to distinguish between what the thing needs and what you need the thing to be. At the bottom, in smaller writing, her grandfather had written a single line, "For whoever finds the hollow birds." She stood at the kitchen counter holding the notebook, and she was quiet for long enough that Esther said her name. "I'm here," Norah said. "He wrote that about 8 years ago," Esther said. "He told me about it after. He said he didn't know who would find them. He just trusted that the person who found them would be the person who was supposed to." Norah looked at the list. She looked at the 12 qualities her grandfather had written down 8 years ago for a person he'd never met, a person he'd simply trusted would exist. She thought about the qualities on the list and whether she had them, and the honest answer was that she had some of them more than others, and the ones she had less of she was still working on, and she would probably be working on them for the rest of her life. That seemed right. That seemed like exactly what the list was for. "Esther," she said. "Yes. Thank you for all of it." A pause. "Don't thank me," Esther said. "Keep the notebooks dry. They won't last if you store them anywhere damp," which was the most Esther Hale response possible, and Norah laughed, genuinely, the kind of laugh that comes from the chest rather than the throat, unexpected and real. "I'll keep them dry," she said. They said good night, and Norah set the phone down and stood in the kitchen where her grandfather had stood, and his mother before him, and she looked at the shelf of 12 composition books, 11 of his, the growing row of hers beside them, and she thought about chains of attention, chains of care, the specific way that what one person learns can become what the next person builds from. If the first person was careful enough to write it down, and the next person was patient enough to read it. She thought about Evan's composition book, which was already in its second volume. She thought about what it would look like in 20 years, 30, what it would contain by then, what he would have learned from the work that she couldn't teach him from a notebook, what new entries would sit at the end of pages not yet written. She didn't know. That was the point. That was always the point. She turned off the kitchen light and went to bed, and in the morning she was up before light the way she always was. And the farm was quiet and cold and waiting, and she put her boots on and went out to it the way she had every morning for the better part of 2 years. Not because she had figured it all out, but because this was what she had chosen, and she had meant the choosing, and meaning the choosing was the whole of it. Outside, past the barn and down the slope toward the north ridge, 300 birds moved through the first gray light of a March morning on land that had been in her family long enough that the soil itself carried the record of their attention. They did not know what they were. They did not need to. She did, and that was enough for both